Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. Today, I'd like to play around a bit with sound. So I'm doing something a bit bizarre at the moment known as talking. Perhaps you've heard of it. Basically, through some combination of vibrating vocal folds, mouth shape, and tongue placement, I suppose, I'm able to create pressure waves that travel through the air at various specific frequencies. Some of these are hitting the microphone here, causing a little membrane inside to vibrate along with them, which in turn moves a coil of wire over a magnet, inducing a voltage of proportional strength. So we get a little signal traveling along the wire to the computer, where it gets measured thousands of times per second, and the values from that are ultimately stored inside of this .wav file over here. Let's kick off our journey today by simply extracting those values and taking a look at them. So after a bit of searching, I came across this page, which nicely lays out the WAV file format, and happily it looks very straightforward. To begin with, we just read in the first bunch of bytes, which are supposed to spell out riff and wave, so if they don't, then we know something's gone terribly wrong. After that, the code just loops through the rest of the file, reading in the name of each section, and adding its location to a little lookup table. The name is always followed by the size of the section, so we can easily skip over to the next section. Basically, I just want to get an overview of what's actually in this thing. So let's run that quickly, and here's what we get. Alright, I'm mainly interested in the format and data sections, so I've just been working on another little function here, which uses our lookup table to just jump to the format chunk, where we can read in some helpful metadata, such as whether this is a mono or stereo file, the number of samples that were recorded per second, and the number of bits in each sample. Then hopping over to the data section, we just read in the data. The data can be in several different formats though, so the final step is to convert it to a nice simple array of floats. To do that, we enter a big loop where we can just keep grabbing however many bytes we've been told are in each sample, and convert them to a float using this handy bytes to float function. Well, I haven't actually written it yet, but it will be handy once I have. Anyway, the value is then scaled down by a normalization factor here, which is just the maximum value that that number of bytes can hold, to bring it into the pleasant range of -1 to +1. And with all that done, we can finally package up the samples and sample rate into this little signal object to be returned as the output over here. Okay, I do still need to write that bytes to float function quickly, and here it is. I even got to use one of my favorite file parsing tricks here, which is simply not bothering to support at least half of the available formats. Of what I did bother to do though, the only slightly tricky case was this 24-bit version, since there's no built-in type for that, so some bit manipulation was required to properly handle negative values. Anyway, let's put this code to the test by loading in helloeveryone.wave, and then drawing points to represent each of the samples. So the x-axis represents time, and the y-axis is proportional to the voltage that was read in from the microphone. Alright, let's try running this quickly, and we can see our audio points appearing. I'll scale this down a little though, so that we can see the info I've printed out down here. So there are just under 40,000 samples in this audio file, and the samples were recorded at a rate of 48,000 per second. Of course, from that we can calculate the duration of the clip as the number of samples divided by the sample rate, giving us around 0.8 seconds in this case. If we zoom in a bit, I think it's pretty cool to see all of these individual points. And even though there are a lot of them, it's quite amazing to me that this is all you need to capture something as complex as a voice, or any other sound for that matter. I think these waveforms are usually visualized with lines rather than points though, so let's try that as well. I've just tweaked the code slightly to now draw each sample as a vertical line, with its length of course representing the amplitude of the sample. And here's what that looks like. I don't just want to look at the sound though, I'd like to hear it as well. So in the Unity engine where I'm working, there is this audio read function, which is triggered every handful of milliseconds with a block of empty data for us to fill up and ship off to the sound card. So while we still have samples remaining from the WAV file, we just loop over the size of that requested block and feed them in. The sound card will then of course instruct the attached speakers or headphones or whatever to vibrate in accordance with that, producing sound waves for our enjoyment or otherwise. So let's play this quickly. Hello everyone, hello everyone, hello everyone, and that works. I think it'd be really cool if we could actually see the waves that this produces in the air. But failing that, I thought it might be fun to use that fluid simulation I made a while back to try and make a crude simulation of the waves at least. Now, doing this in 3 dimensions could certainly be interesting, but let's rather go with the 2D version of the simulation today for simplicity's sake. I would like this fluid to behave more like air than water though, of course, so we should probably turn off the gravity. And turn down the target density here as well. Currently, we're visualizing the individual particles, but for this I'd actually prefer to look at the density of the fluid, since that's closely related to the pressure. To do that, I've just added a new kernel to the compute shader quickly, that just runs for each texel in a given texture, and sets its color based on the density calculation for that texel's position in space. Just as a reminder, or in case you haven't seen the fluid episode, the density is essentially just a smoothed out sum of the number of particles inside of a small radius around that location. And here's what that looks like. Okay, it certainly seems like we can make some nice pressure waves in here. Although, hang on, what's that weird little bubble that just appeared? Oh jeez, there's a whole bunch of them now. I'm definitely going to need to tweak the settings a bit more. That is not supposed to be happening. Alright, this seems to be a bit more stable now. The main problem was that I still had the viscosity turned on from the water settings, and I had also increased the number of particles from around 15,000 up to 75,000, which then caused things to go a little haywire. The simulation is pretty finicky. But anyway, I think our next step now is to just make a little rectangular obstacle in the fluid here, which is something the simulation already supports. And this is going to act as our speaker membrane, basically just vibrating back and forth along with the audio samples. So to control this, I've written this function here, which takes in some input audio signal, and then looks up the sample value at the current time, and uses that to offset the position of the speaker membrane. Looking up the sample value is done with this helper function, by the way, which simply interpolates linearly through the discrete sample values, allowing the speaker to move somewhat smoothly instead of jumping instantaneously. Then to record the sound produced by these waves, I've got a minuscule microphone method here, which just looks up the density of the fluid at the given location, and then subtracts from that the rest density of the fluid. That's finally multiplied by some arbitrary constant to give us a pressure value, which is saved to this list of recorded samples so that we can play back the sound. Alright, for the input audio, I'm just going to use this 4-second clip. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. And I've set up the simulation here with a little plot at the bottom to show our recorded pressure values. So all that remains to be done is run this and see how it goes. Pretty badly is the answer. I can try playing back our recording, but as you can hear, all we've managed to capture is the sound of silence. I guess the main problem is that in the 4 seconds that the simulation ran, we were only able to do about 1200 simulation steps, meaning we only captured 1200 pressure values, whereas the original audio contained 192,000 of them. So I think our best bet is to run this again, but in extreme slow motion. Okay, I've tried slowing the speaker's time step down now so that every 1 second of input audio takes 100 seconds in the simulation. It is still vibrating pretty rapidly though, so perhaps that's still not slow enough. The pressure plot is looking a lot more promising this time around, however, so I'm excited to hear what this sounds like. Okay, that was a little painful to listen to perhaps, but you can actually just barely make out the words I'm saying, at least with headphones on, so that's pretty cool I think. Alright, I'm trying now slowing things down even more, since it did seem like the speaker was still moving faster than the fluid could properly react to a lot of the time. At the moment I'm trying this with a ridiculously slow update speed where every second of input audio corresponds to 15 minutes in the simulation. Alright, so after an hour of impatiently waiting for this 4-second clip to finish, it is at last complete, and let's have a listen to what we've recorded.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode
Okay, that's not bad. A little on the crackly side, of course, but honestly better than I was expecting. Now, I just had a thought. Not a particularly sage thought, but nonetheless, some of you may be familiar with Bad Apple, but it's a fluid simulation. Well, the song could technically be a fluid simulation too now. Here's a snippet for your consideration. Moving on, while we are able to open WAV files and play them currently, we can't actually save them yet. So I've just quickly been working on a little function here for doing that. There's not much of interest to say about it, but I do want to test it quickly. So we can read in welcome.wave, and then spice it up a little maybe by reversing the order of the samples, and then try saving that. Okay, so we should be able to... never mind. Alright, after eventually tracking down a critical mistake in the code, we should now be able to play our saved WAV files. It seems like a fun challenge to try actually speaking in reverse like this. So I've tried to transcribe these backward sounds here, and let me give this a shot. Okay, so here's that recording, then we reverse it, and play. Alright, that sounds pretty normal. Now, beyond reversing audio, we can also super easily do things like slow it down, for instance, simply by lying that it was recorded at a lower sample rate than it actually was, or the opposite, of course, if we want to speed it up. So I'll save these quickly, and let's hear how they sound.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures.
So doing this changes the pitch of the sound, of course, since we're squishing or stretching out the waves, which means we're altering the frequencies.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures.
This actually gives me an idea for what I'd like to tackle today, which is to learn how we can figure out these frequencies that make up a sound, because if we can do that, it would open up a whole world of possibilities for analyzing and manipulating our data. This real data we have is a little intimidating in its complexity though, so I think we should maybe generate a simple synthetic signal just to start with. So I've been writing this little function here where we're given a frequency, sample rate, and duration, and we first of all just figure out how many samples fit into that duration and create an array to hold all of them. Then as we loop over that array, we calculate the current time from 0 up to the duration, and then say that this angle here is equal to time times tau times the frequency. And finally, our sample value is just the sine or cosine of that angle. It doesn't really matter which for our purposes. Now, just to make sure we're working from a solid foundation, I'd like to take a moment to dwell on some basics and think about what exactly tau and the frequency are doing to the time value. So, as you likely know, sine and cosine can be thought of as the vertical and horizontal coordinate values of a point traveling around a unit circle. Now, that point has to travel a distance of roughly 6.28 units in order to circumnavigate its tiny world, and whatever that exact distance is defined as the constant tau, also known as 2 times pi. So rather than thinking about angles in degrees, where one full turn about the circle would be the somewhat arbitrary value of 360, it's quite natural to think in terms of radians instead, where an angle of 1 radian means taking the radius of the circle and then walking that distance along the circumference. This then means, of course, that tau radians describes a full rotation around the circle. And so when we multiply our time value by tau before feeding it into the sine or cosine functions, we're simply saying that one journey around the circle should take place over the course of 1 second. And multiplying that by the frequency parameter then just directly modifies the number of turns per second. Alright, so with that in mind, let's try plotting the simple signal that this code produces. I have the frequency set to 1 at the moment, and we're looking at a duration of 4 seconds, so we can imagine the point going 4 times around the circle in that time, resulting in the 4 full oscillations that we're seeing here. In terms of the sound waves that we're thinking about today, this plot represents the pressure of the air at a certain point over time. The peaks, of course, being where the air molecules are tightly bunched together, known as compressions, and the troughs being where the molecules are more spread apart than they typically be, known as rarefactions. This 1 Hz signal is well below human hearing though, so I'd like to set it to something that's actually audible, like 150 Hz, let's say. To be able to see that properly, let's first zoom in to maybe 1/10 of a second here and crank up the sample rate, and then finally increase the frequency. This is a bit of a boring signal containing just a single frequency though, so to spice things up, I've added this little frequency data structure to the code, which holds not only the frequency value itself, but also an associated amplitude and phase value. Then I've also modified our signal generation function to accept an array of this frequency data, and our sampled value is now a sum of the contributions from each of them. The strength of each contribution can be controlled with the amplitude, of course, and the angle can now also be offset using the phase value. Alright, so I've set up 3 copies of our 150 Hz wave over here, and at the top we can see how they're combining together to create our final signal. Okay, let's try changing the frequency of one of these here to see how that affects the result. And perhaps we can decrease its amplitude a little bit. Then let's mess around with the second wave as well, maybe increase the frequency a bit, and also try out our new phase parameter, which simply shifts the wave left or right. Alright, so we've synthesized some kind of sound here, and I've hooked each of the component waves up to that audio playing function we made earlier, so we can listen to them. Here is 150 Hz, here is 214, and here is 357. And while they might not sound entirely delightful on their own, together they combine to create something not particularly pleasant either. Synthesizing sounds that actually sound nice though, I think will be the topic of an entire future episode. What's important for today is just that we can create different sounds by combining waves of different frequency, phases, and amplitudes. And as I was saying earlier, what I really want to do is learn how we can take a sound like this that we've recorded and sort of reverse engineer the individual frequency, phases, and amplitudes that went into it. Now, I'm vaguely aware that the mathematical tool we need is the Discrete Fourier Transform. The discrete part I understand, we obviously have a finite number of audio samples, not some theoretical continuous signal. But as for the Fourier bit, I have no idea how it works, though mercifully there is a 3 Blue 1 Brown video on the topic, so I'm going to start there.
So this little mathematical machine does exactly what we wanted. It pulls out the original frequencies from their jumbled up sums, unmixing the mixed bucket of paint.
Okay, I've just finished watching this through, and conceptually at least, it is actually surprisingly simple. I highly recommend watching that video, of course, but I do also want to work through what I've learned over here, and see if we can actually put it into practice. So let's begin with a wave with a frequency of 1, sampled over a duration of 1 second for simplicity. And currently, this is being plotted with time along the horizontal axis. But let's see what it looks like if we instead have it going around in a circle. So I've been working on this little visualization function here, which takes in an array of our sampled values, and then loops over all of those and calculates an angle that starts at 0 and goes all the way up to tau. From that angle, we calculate this test point, and we then scale that by the current sample value to get what I've called the sample point over here. Then to visualize this, we're drawing a trail of all of the sample points we've calculated so far in green, along with the current test point in red, and an arrow showing how that test point gets transformed into the sample point. Alright, so let's take a look at this. At the beginning, we can see our test point over here, and the sample point is actually hiding beneath it at the moment, since our first sample value is 1, as shown on our old plot down here. So let's let the visualization run through all of the samples quickly. And we can see that we've ended up plotting this little green circle of sample points that's kind of offset to one side. Let me rewind this for a moment so we can see what exactly happened here. So we started out with a sample value of 1 as we saw before, but then once we made a quarter turn, the input sample is now at 0, and so we can see that the sample point is scaled down to the origin here. Going another quarter turn to the halfway mark, the sample value is now -1, and so the sample point just ends up back where it started. So we can see why this ends up making that little offset circle. Now I want to try playing around with the parameters of our simple single frequency signal to get more of an intuition for how they affect things. Changing the amplitude is obvious enough, that just shrinks or grows the circle. So let's move on to the phase, and we can see how that simply offsets the angle at which the little circle begins. Okay, finally, let's try changing the frequency. So we can see what happens if we take that all the way down to 0. And then let's also try increasing it up to a value of 4 maybe. Alright, that's made a pleasant petal pattern. And if we play through this, we can see that as our test point travels once around the circle, we're going through 4 cycles of our simple signal, and so the sample points get spread out around the circle. If we wanted to be able to synchronize the test point with the signal again, we could just have a new input to our function here called something like the test frequency, which would determine how many times the test point spins around the circle. So now if we return to the visualization and try increasing this test frequency, we can see that once it matches up with the frequency of the input signal, we get back this perfect little offset circle from before. Then if we increase the test frequency past that, we can see that things quickly become all spread out around the circle again. So one way we could detect if our test frequency has matched the signal's frequency is by observing the center of all these sample points. Because when they're all spread out, that center should be at 0, whereas when we get our little offset circle, that center point would be offset to the side as well. Let's try this out. So to calculate the center, we simply have to sum up all of these sample points, and then divide that sum by the total number of samples to find the average, which I've called the sample center here. And let's actually draw that in quickly. Then returning to our visualization, let's see whether this works as expected. So we can see that with all these samples spread out around the circle, everything kind of cancels out, resulting in the sample center indeed being 0. Then let's try bringing the test frequency back down, and we can see that this sample center does move around a tiny bit, but it always seems to return to 0 when we're at an integer test frequency. I suppose if the test frequency is not an integer value, that means that the test point doesn't spin a whole number of times around the circle, and so the start and end sample points don't have any hope of lining up into a nice periodic pattern, knocking things slightly off balance. Anyway, I want to try bringing the test frequency down to 4, which we know should be the frequency of our input signal here, and we can see how in this case the sample center does not go back to 0 of course, since it's now in the middle of our little offset circle. Alright, then finally, if we reduce the test frequency further, we can see that the sample center goes back to circling through 0 like before. So clearly we can test for integer frequencies at least by simply observing if the sample center has moved away from 0. But then again, we're currently looking at the ridiculously simple case where the input signal contains only a single frequency, so this doesn't seem like much of an accomplishment. Let's experiment then with a signal made up from a few different frequencies, which I'll set to maybe 3, 5, and 9. The test frequency is currently at 1, so let's try increasing that now. And once we reach a value of 3, the lowest frequency in our signal, we can see how, similar to before, things suddenly line up over here, causing our sample center to move away from 0. But with these other frequencies interfering, our sample points don't make a perfect circle anymore. So let's investigate for a moment what effect exactly the other two frequencies are having right now. We can begin maybe by messing with the amplitude of the frequency 5 wave over here, and then with its phase as well. And what we can see in both cases is that while the positions of all the sample points are obviously affected, the average position, our so-called sample center, is not perturbed in the slightest. Non-integer frequency values do cause a bit of wobble as we've seen before, but otherwise the sample center is unaffected by all frequencies other than the test frequency. So that's pretty cool, and it makes sense if we consider each of the individual waves in isolation. Wave A on its own is currently making this familiar little offset circle, since it matches our test frequency. Meanwhile, wave B is making this symmetric pattern spread out around the circle, since it doesn't match the test frequency. And same story with wave C. So it shouldn't come as much surprise then, that when we add waves C and B onto wave A, their contributions just cancel out and don't affect the sample center. Let me actually momentarily disable those other frequencies again, since we've determined they don't make a difference here. And let's just consider the fact that only the amplitude of wave A in this case has any effect on the distance of the sample center from the origin. So perhaps this was obvious already, but it's not merely telling us that the current test frequency exists in the signal, but also the precise strength of that frequency. Or I guess more accurately, since the sample center is in the middle of this little circle, the distance tells us half the strength, and we'd have to double it to extract the actual amplitude. Similarly, since the phase of this same frequency is the only thing determining the angle of the sample center about the origin, that means that we could actually extract that phase value from the angle. So that's pretty cool, but anyway, I'm going to reset all these parameters I've been fiddling with here to take us back to our original signal, and let's just quickly try some other test frequencies to confirm that this is working as we believe. So going up to a value of 4, we can see that the sample center is at the origin, indicating that this frequency is not present in the signal. So we can move on up to frequency 5, and here it is shot out to the left, telling us that the frequency is present in the signal with an amplitude of 0.4, and that the phase is offset by half a turn. Then, just for completeness sake, let's increase the test frequency one last time, and as we're very accustomed to by now, the sample center circles through 0 for a while, until we reach a value of 9, the highest frequency in the signal, at which moment it leaps out to the side here. I think it might be interesting to try plotting this distance value of the sample center across different test frequencies. So I've quickly written some code to do that, and let's see how it goes. So we've got nice big bumps, of course, at frequencies 3, 5, and 9, since as we've seen, these bumps correspond to the amplitudes of those frequencies. We can also, of course, see the little bumps in between the integer values where things aren't quite lining up properly. I'm curious to see how this looks if we try modifying one of the frequencies in the signal. And that's quite interesting. So when it's an integer value, everything looks fine, but for fractional values, we can see how it's actually sort of polluting the results of all of the frequencies around it. I am a bit confused about how we're supposed to deal with that exactly, so I'll need to do some more research and/or thinking, I suppose. But right now, I think it'd be more fun to just try and convert our visualization into more of an actual implementation of the discrete Fourier transform, and see how it goes. Okay, so after working on this for a while, it's clear that I definitely have a number of holes still in my understanding. First of all, I'm not sure what the maximum frequency is we should actually test for. I went with 20,000 Hz, since that's roughly the limit of human hearing, but it feels wrong to be hard-coding this value because we might be trying to analyze the calls of bats for all I know, which go well above human hearing. Not to mention that sound isn't even the only kind of data one might want to work with. Beyond that, I'm also uncertain how to properly handle signals that aren't conveniently exactly 1 second long. My current thought is to simply multiply the angle here by the duration, because if we're trying to test a frequency of 5, for example, and the duration is 2 seconds, then I think it makes sense that we'd go 10 times around the circle in that time. But I'm concerned about non-integer durations, because then we wouldn't be making full turns around the circle, and we saw how that causes problems. And of course, I'm still confused about how to detect non-integer frequencies. Like, for example, if we have a frequency of 7.5 in the signal, I want to detect this peak over here at 7.5. And ideally, I'd want to ignore these little bumps that aren't even supposed to be there. What I'm trying at the moment is just picking an arbitrary resolution of 10, meaning we go in steps of 1/10 for the test frequency, and once all the phases and amplitudes have been calculated for each frequency, I then run through and try to pick out just the primary peaks. My faith in this implementation is as bottomless as a puddle, but let's try it out. So we have this function from earlier that takes in a bunch of frequency data and generates a signal from it. And so we can now load in an audio file like our welcome.wave, extract the frequency data using the Fourier transform, and then generate a signal from that frequency data to hopefully create an accurate reconstruction of the original signal. Now, my very first attempt did not go particularly well, but after hacking away for a bit, this was the next result. This time there seems to be some trace of a voice in there, which I was tremendously excited about, and after another bout of tinkering, arriving at the code I just recently showed, and then waiting several minutes for it to run because it is painfully slow, here is the latest reconstruction.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures.
Okay, it's a bit muffled to be sure, and with an annoying background drone like we're inside an aeroplane, but otherwise it's pretty close. I'm going to try removing my very crude attempt at eliminating small peaks because I think that might be causing the muffling, and let's see how that sounds. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. The voice is indeed a lot clearer now, but there's still a lot of strange background noise. Let's try maybe getting rid of the peak detection entirely, and I'll set the resolution to 1 then, so that we're only testing the integer frequencies. Alright, let's hear it. Hello everyone. Okay, I don't know what's happening there. I am pretty sure we're just a tweak or two away from this working properly, but I don't want to keep changing things blindly, so let's actually try to tackle those things I mentioned being uncertain about, and then try to implement this again. First of all, I've been looking into how we could figure out the maximum frequency that a signal might contain, and it wasn't long before I arrived at the Nyquist-Shannon sampling theorem. The basic idea seems to go something like this. Say there's a pure 80 Hz signal out in the real world, and we come along and record it at perhaps 8,000 samples per second. This seems to capture the shape well enough, but an interesting question is, could we record it at a lower rate without losing any information? And if so, how low could we go? Well, let's first of all try dropping the sample rate all the way down to 80 Hz. And clearly this is too low because the sampled values just make it look like a flat line. To fix that, let's try incrementing the sample rate by 1. And now our samples do appear to be creating a wave at least, but it looks like a much lower frequency than in reality. This is a problem known as aliasing. Alias as in the samples have assumed a false identity. Now, we can see that this is happening due to the times at which we're sampling the signal being so far apart that they are leaping over entire peaks and valleys at a time. If we wanted to ensure that there was always at least one sample between each peak and valley, we could simply choose a sample rate that is double the highest frequency in the signal, so in this case 160. And this is known as the Nyquist rate. It's the slowest we can record, while avoiding those aliasing artifacts. Technically, we could get catastrophically unlucky with the phase though, and end up with a flat line again, so it's best to sample at least one step above the Nyquist rate. And now we can see that no matter what the phase is, our sample values never collapse into a flat line, nor do they ever masquerade as some lower frequency. Still, something that confused me for a little while is that these samples kind of make it seem as if the strength of the signal is changing over time. Like here it looks like it starts out loud, then gets soft, and then grows loud again. What the theorem tells us though is that by sampling at this Nyquist rate, we guarantee that no other signal exists that would result in these exact same samples. The only way for a different signal to pass through these samples would be if it contained a frequency beyond what we accounted for with our sample rate, and in that case, obviously, we should fix it. But there's no need to increase the sampling rate just to make the recording look more accurate, because in fact these excessive samples contain the same amount of actual information as these samples do. Knowing all this, we could think about what a good sample rate for audio would be. So starting with the fact that humans can hear up to roughly 20 kHz, we know that that needs to be sampled at least 40 kHz. Except of course, just because 20 is the limit of our hearing doesn't mean that higher frequencies don't exist, and through aliasing as we saw, those would manifest themselves as lower frequency distortions. But we can use filters to cut those high frequencies out prior to sampling, though the filters are not perfect devices, so we should tack on a few extra kilohertz to our sampling rate to tolerate that, which lands us in the neighborhood of the standardized sampling rates of 44.1 and 48 kilohertz. Anyway, what's most important from all this is that I now understand that we don't need to hardcode some maximum frequency here, because the maximum frequency is determined by the sampling rate. The next thing I want to figure out then is how to properly handle this resolution stuff, so that we're not limited to just integer frequencies. So let's bring back our little visualization here, and we're looking at a 1 Hz wave sampled at 50 Hz for a duration of 1 second. Now, what we observed before is that only the integer frequencies seem to give good results, because if I set our example wave here to a frequency of 1.5 for instance, we can see that the sampled values don't form a periodic wave, meaning that on the circle, the start and end points don't line up nicely, which makes things a little wonky. Now, increasing the sample rate doesn't change that, of course, so if we recorded our hypothetical signal at 100 Hz instead, that would just increase the range of frequencies we could detect, but not the resolution. There is one other parameter when we're recording something though, and that is the duration that we record it for. So let's try increasing the duration from 1 second up to 2 seconds now. And as we can see, the sampled values of the 1.5 Hz wave are actually periodic in this time frame, since 1.5 times 2 is 3, and that's an integer value. So if we increase our test frequency up to 3, we can see that we're now detecting that 1.5 Hz frequency. Of course, we could go even further and record for a duration of 10 seconds, and now we can see that a frequency of 1.4 is periodic as well, and so too is 1.3, 1.2, 1.1, and so on, for all increments of 1/10. So to detect this frequency of 1.1, we just need to set our test frequency 10 times higher, to 11, and now we can see that it's picking up on that. So increasing the duration of the signal means that we get a higher frequency resolution, and this phenomenon we noticed in which frequencies that don't align with that resolution kind of spill out and affect the surrounding frequencies is something known as spectral leakage, and we can explore some ways to maybe combat that a bit in the future. But for now, I've just been working on a new version of the Fourier function that uses everything we've just learnt. In here, we begin by figuring out how many different frequencies we can detect, which is just going to be equal to the maximum frequency, so the sample rate divided by 2, multiplied by the duration of the signal, since that determines the resolution. And that all simplifies to just be the number of samples divided by 2. We then create an array of frequency data with that size, called the spectrum, to hold our results. Next up, we calculate the frequency step size, which is to say the spacing between each of the frequencies we'll be detecting. And we saw, for example, a moment ago, that if our recording is 10 seconds long, then we'd be able to detect increments of 1/10. So it's just 1 over the duration, or equivalently, it's the sample rate divided by the number of samples. After that, we just loop over all the frequency bins in our spectrum, and for each of them, we calculate the sample center, just like we did when making the visualization, and we extract from that the amplitude and the phase. Finally, we figure out which frequency we've just detected, and store all of that information in the spectrum here. Comparing this code with some implementations I found online, I did notice at least one minor mistake I made, which concerns this amplitude calculation. We've seen that in general, we need to multiply by 2 in order to get the correct amplitude, but there is a special case, which is if our signal contains a 0 frequency component, which just means that it's shifted vertically by some amount. When we test for 0 Hz, we can see that all the sample points pile up on top of one another, instead of forming that little circle we typically see, and so multiplying by 2 is not needed. This also happens, by the way, in one other special case, which is where the frequency is exactly equal to half the sample rate, and I've tweaked the code here to account for these subtle details. Alright, with that done, let's try taking our Fourier function for a test spin. So I've set up a simple signal here, and the highest frequency is 17, so we should be able to bring the sample rate all the way down to 35. And now let's see whether we're able to reconstruct the shape of the original signal from just these samples. There are ways to do this directly, by the way, but we're trying to test our Fourier function, of course. So in the code, we'll feed those samples into our function to get the frequency data, and then generate a signal from that with a lot of samples so that we can draw it in as a nice line path here in purple. Okay, let's try running this. And that is looking good, I think. We can try changing some of these parameters here to see how that goes. And then to confirm that it is actually reconstructing the signal correctly, let's increase the sample rate. And that seems to match perfectly. So let's see now how this reconstruction fares on an actual audio signal. And I've tweaked the visualization here so that we can watch the reconstruction in process as it adds together waves of all the different frequencies we extracted. That's kind of fun to see, although at the higher frequencies there's not much change it seems, so let's just speed through those. I'd be curious to see the amplitudes of the individual frequencies, so here's some quick code for doing that, just looping over the frequency data and drawing vertical lines to indicate the amplitude. And here's how that looks. I've only bothered drawing it up to 5000 Hz here, because after that the amplitudes become extremely small. What I think might be interesting to try actually is to sort the frequency data by these amplitudes, and then we can reconstruct the audio from various numbers of these most important frequencies. Okay, so after letting the machine crunch the numbers for a while, let's now hear what the audio sounds like with just the top 5 most influential frequencies. Basically just a low hum at this point. So then let's try the top 50. That's a bit more interesting sounding, but I can't make out any speech yet, so here's the top 250. Suddenly some semblance of speech seems to have emerged. At least with headphones on and straining my ears a little, I feel like I can make out the words, although that is perhaps only because I know what they are. In any case, let's go up to 750 now. Alright, getting clearer. Let's do 1500. And then let's jump to 5000.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures.
Okay, the speech is very clear now, with just some slightly annoying background hum and hiss. So let's jump finally to 100,000 and hear how that sounds. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Coding Adventures. I'd say that that's indistinguishable from the original. So we've more or less confirmed that our Fourier transform is working at last, and there are so many different things I want to experiment with now. But currently the code is painfully slow to work with, and while there are certainly some easy optimizations we could make, what I really want to do is implement a fancy algorithm called the fast Fourier transform. I am definitely going to need a minute to wrap my head around that though, so it'll have to wait for a future episode. For now, I hope you've enjoyed watching and listening as I've stumbled along with all this stuff, and of course, if you notice any mistakes I've made or have some ideas for things I should try out, please let me know. Alright, until next time, cheers.